we are now asking questions if an intervention, if an outcome is clinically important. Does it make a difference in a clinical setting? Is it socially significant for people who are affected? Does it result in qualitative change? And depending on an article that you read, sometimes it is referred to as ecological validity. And it definitely relates to another concept of external validity, if you think about internal and external validity. Okay, so in the chapter, they mentioned that it has 3 dimensions, or let's just say at least 3 dimensions. The dimensions would be goals. Are the goals socially important? Procedures. Are the procedures socially acceptable? And outcomes. Are the outcomes socially significant? And when you think about it, it's important to consider not just after a study ends, but also during an intervention, during all phases of an intervention. Also, if you're piloting an intervention, you want to think about the social validity. It will help, of course, to have open-ended questions to avoid influencing participants' answers. Okay, let's keep going. Quantification of social validity. So the book goes into the point of view, there's some merit to it, that you want to quantify social validity if you can. So there are things that are called normative comparisons. In this situation, you would take the outcomes of participants in your study, and you would compare them to typical individuals who also were in your study. So let's say you were collecting data on 3 kids, and there were pairs of kids that were typical who were just participating, they were just in the classroom, and you want to see at the end of the study how the participants that were your target participants compared to typical individuals. And so therefore you're collecting data on individuals in both of these 2 groups. Okay, so if normative comparisons are not feasible or desirable, you could think about consumer evaluations. And then the 2 categories that are probably most of interest to us, although they go into a 3rd category in the book, seems kind of hypothetical, but the direct consumers, in other words, the recipients, maybe a child was the focus of the intervention. And if that case, you ask the kids, did you find that the way we taught you these lessons, did you like them? Did you find that they were useful? In writing interventions, a lot of times researchers will ask, do you think you will use this kind of approach to writing in other writing situations or other writing assignments? You ask the kids. If the intervention is focused on parents, they could be the direct recipient, and you ask them. And same thing about teachers. The second layer of evaluation for consumers would be people who are indirectly affected. So if the child was the direct participant, target participant, you ask the parents, and so on. So you could ask people who might know more about or provide a different perspective, an outsider perspective, as opposed to people who are directly affected. So you want to consider, do people, choose people who you think are relevant, that they actually might know, and think about if there's an opportunity in the natural environment to find people who could be insiders or relative outsiders. Okay, so those are 2 different types of social validity that can be quantified, more objective measures. All right, so what else? What else could you do? Well, it relates to, it's the same technique. You could videotape performance before and after an intervention, and you could look at the videotapes to see if you notice or other people could also notice clinically significant change. So that would be one way to do this. And I'm saying you could videotape performance during treatment as well if you wanted to check for the fidelity, but that's actually bringing in a different concept that I talked about earlier today. So videotaping performance before and after, that's one way. Other ways would be whole sets of interviews, questionnaires, or rating scales. So whether or not you can ask people else to go in for you and do the interview, or if people could mail in anonymously, that would help with bias, because clearly if you're the one who provided the intervention and you ask kids, they may just be wanting to please you and end the interview or something like that. Also, some people have, and I'm going to go through some examples. The first one especially shows you that there could be Likert type scales that you could use, and you could assess the acceptability of classroom intervention. So let's look at some examples. Some of them are intervention rating profiles, and then there are some published research examples as well. It's just some short vignettes. Okay, so here we go on that. Okay, so hopefully you can see the slide. This was from a published article, and it was a treatment acceptability rating form. This is actually only showing you some of the questions. One of them would be with these Likert type ratings. How clear is your understanding of the suggested procedure? How acceptable do you find the strategies to be regarding your concerns about the identified learner? How willing are you to implement the suggested procedures as you heard them described? And so you could develop questions like this yourself, model your questions after things like this. I'm going to just go to actually the last three on the other side. How much discomfort is your learner likely to experience as a result of the procedures? How willing would you be to change your classroom routine to implement them? And how well will carrying out the procedures fit into your classroom routine? So depending on if you're doing a project this semester and you're working with a child, then you have access to a parent who could provide you with an outsider perspective. That would be great. Those are the kinds of things you could develop. Okay, let's look at another example, a different kind of a form. It is also to get aspects of social validity. The first item here is the student is engaged in academic or vocational work tasks, sitting appropriately, and that's described, and attending to the teacher or material. So if the observation shows that that is actually true, then that would give some evaluation after the intervention that it was something which actually did improve the functioning of a student. So this also is geared for kids who have severe disabilities. Let's just look at another one. Let me look to see. The third one down says the student appears to have a positive affect, for example, smiling and laughing. So do you think that that's true? Okay, so you could have an observer come in and look and see what's going on in a class. Okay, here's a different type of rating system, finding that the treatment is socially acceptable. That's number one, willing to use, and so forth. So it's just the same kind of question. Maybe you like this format a little bit better than the one that I showed you prior. I like number 7. I believe the treatment is likely to result in permanent improvement. That would be really great to know. Okay, you could even give this before and after an intervention too. If you think that you're going to see the possibility that people will become more positive, because I mean, sometimes interventions seem to be a little bit more complicated than people think they're willing to do. And then after they engage in an intervention, they find after the fact, you know, it really was meaningful and important. And I'm glad that either I or my child went through it. Okay, here's another example from an article where you see averages. And what's really nice about this example, I don't know if any of you see something like this, then please bring it up in class to let all of us know. So this is an article that was some time ago, but for each of the 3 individuals, well, actually 2 with autism and 1 that was typical, they're showing average pre and post intervention on important measures. So how interested is the child in interacting with his mother? The 2 kids with autism, pre-intervention were pretty low, post-intervention much higher. Boy, you can compare it to the typically developing peer who before and after the child didn't need an intervention, but the rate of interaction was much higher. And so you can see that this is a really good result. The second one here is how communicative and expressive does the child appear? And again, we see some positive outcomes and positive comparisons to the normative comparison. So that's a great example. One other example here was pre and post, where an observer can evaluate, and you can see the extent to which we have averages. That's the M. M stands for average. Sometimes in articles, they'll just use M for mean. It is the average, and then the standard deviation is shown in parentheses. And then here we also see a p-value is shown so that if something is statistically significant or not. And in this case, all of these improvements were statistically significant. And it's good to see the standard deviations because that's the amount of variation around the mean. If that's something, we haven't talked about in this class yet, but if you look at the difference between 3.56 and 4.68 for the first outcome, and you're like, it doesn't seem to be like that much different. Well, when you factor in the standard deviations and you do a statistical test, for example, a t-test, you would see that in this case, it's being reported to be statistically significant. So that's another example. And I think I have just one more. This is a little bit different. It's just a summary in an article that was a reading intervention. I remember seeing this some time ago. Lindo and Elman, they included social validity, and they made the point that teachers can give a true picture of the expense and practicality of an intervention and just to indicate if the intervention is acceptable. So that's super, super important, especially if you're interested in sustainability. If an intervention doesn't fit in a classroom context, if teachers cannot implement it easily, if kids don't find it enjoyable, or if kids lose access to other skills or opportunities because they're spending time to focus on an intervention that a researcher has in mind, then those would all be limitations. Okay, so those are just some final thoughts on social validity. And when you think about the assessment, if you're doing a project in the semester, what would social validity look like in your classroom? Okay, so you want to think about that.